He called the housing crash. He called the collapse of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. He's been harping on the crisis in the Eurozone banking system for years now.
Today, we're going to talk about the peer-to-peer economy. The peer-to-peer economy is the business premise behind the Veritasium platform. What the peer-to-peer economy is a new form of capitalistic exchange of commerce, of business. Traditionally, we've had a hub and spoke economy. I'd say for the last 10,000 some odd years. Before then, we were going to go prehistoric, caveman days, etc. Let's not do that very simplistic form of barter. But for the last 10,000 years, primarily the last 2,000 years, somewhere around the birth of Christ, going on towards the birth of banking, mercantilism, and then moving on towards right after the Great Depression, when central banking became in vogue. And then we had the fractional reserve banking system, which allows banks to basically extend beyond lend and borrow beyond the meager means of their actual equity. This has been long-standing, arguably successful. We've had some pretty big crashes, but some fairly big booms. I don't necessarily think that big booms and crashes are a success, but it has worked. But the reason why we went through mercantilism, barter, fractional reserve banking, and the traditional banking model that we have is because that was pretty much the only way it was able to be accomplished in scale and in mass. Enter the peer-to-peer economy, which is the direct contrast, almost in direct contravention to the hub and spoke economy, which is the backbone of our current banking system. So, enough words, let's use hand motions and simple diagrams. Hub and spoke, where we have a hub and we have spokes. So this hub will be the large banks. In the US, JP Morgan, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo. Same thing in the EU, UK, Asia, etc. Deutsche, HSBC. And then we have the spokes, which are basically the other members of the economy, the economic system. Small and medium-sized businesses, regional banks, national banks, exchanges, etc. So business is always done through a centralized authoritarian party. Okay? The reasons why is because you need to go and gather capital en masse. The business model of a bank is to take a very small amount of equity, lever up, okay, and then lend that capital mass out, assets out. Usually, banks lever up by taking a small amount of equity and then bringing in a large amount of deposits. So the bank's purpose is to connect savers or depositors with risk consumers, people who want to consume capital. So you've worked hard, you've produced capital, you want to save it, you give it to the bank. A lot of people thought they were putting their money in basically an electronic safe deposit box. That's not the case. You are an unsecured lender, an investor into a bank with a relatively meager return. The bank takes that capital and then invests it to the greater economy, usually to risk consumers, okay, who actually want to take capital and do business with it. That is all well and good. And that was pretty much the purpose of the bank, and the bank became this massive middleman. But the bank had to reach for yield, particularly as banks gambled a lot. They wrecked the economy. The central banking system then came in. Central banks drove interest rates down, zero, towards negative, into the negative area, used asset buying programs, QE, etc., to try and bolster bank balance sheets to make up for these errors. And in previous videos, I explained that's like taking a drowning man, picking him up by his neck out of the water. You save him from drowning, but you choke him out because he can't breathe. So the central bank systems saved the banks on their balance sheet side, but choked them on their income statement side. So these banks are reaching for yield, even now, doing more risky things, and we're back to exactly where we started from. But the banks are still doing their basic job, connecting capital savers with capital consumers, okay, en masse. That's no longer necessary. with blockchain technology, capital savers can now meet the capital consumers, or capital producers can meet the capital consumers, and they can do it directly without the hub, without the middleman, without the intermediary. Through the blockchain, they can meet peer-to-peer and they can transact business. Less friction, less cost, and believe it or not, they can do it with greater safety because the blockchain is immutable. This is where Veritasium comes in, the peer-to-peer economy. So instead of having big middlemen, big gateways, big authoritarian gatekeepers, you have basically nobody in the middle. You have code connect everybody, just like the internet connects everybody, and they do business, conduct enterprise on a friction-free basis. So what example is very similar to this? Let's go back to the 1960s and 70s. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and we had media. Basically, if you go to encyclopedias, in order for me to learn something, I had to go to a central repository of knowledge controlled by a very small amount of individuals or corporations, such as Encyclopedia Britannica, Encyclopedia Americana, etc., the New Book of Knowledge. I actually have a couple of those somewhere around from the 70s. And I was able to learn, but I was only able to learn what that particular entity or group of entities either wanted me to learn, either thought was the truth, or either wanted to get out as fact or truth. Enter another platform, another algorithm-driven, another platform, protocol-driven platform, which is the internet, IP, Internet Protocol. That platform allowed a proliferation of information because you no longer had to go through central gatekeepers, and individuals were able to send information and data back and forth on a peer-to-peer basis or close to a peer-to-peer basis, peer through servers, but the servers were controlled by centralized entities, to others. So as close to peer-to-peer as we've had ever, okay? In doing that, you've had an explosion of information, and you've had new decentralized style encyclopedias, such as Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia gets a lot of flack, but Wikipedia has more content than any encyclopedia, is arguably more accurate, especially when you compare it to the actual content it has than any encyclopedia, because many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of peers contribute to it, okay? Censorship, even though it does occur in Wikipedia, much more difficult to do in Wikipedia than it is going through one company, where basically you're reading what they want you to read. So the internet has changed information consumption, information availability, and as a result has dropped significantly the price and cost of information and friction. The result is you have individuals such as myself who can get the word out without having to pay, a $4 or $5 million production budget. I create a video, throw it up on YouTube. A lot of people get to see it. This video has information that many in the mainstream media may not want you to see or hear, but they don't have control because now this is much more of a peer speaking to a peer, one peer to one peer, one peer to many peers. That is the precursor to the peer-to-peer economy. We have the blockchain or the Bitcoin blockchain. Bitcoin is one blockchain of many, but is so far still the most prominent, the most economically proven, the most technologically proven. And that blockchain connects many peers, and now they can do business with each other. Peter does business with Paul, who does business with Paulette, who does business with Jane. Okay? That is the invention. That is the wonder of the blockchain to this very minute. The vast majority of those dealing in cryptocurrencies and blockchains and digital currencies, etc., I think they still fail to see the economic marvel because they're thinking in terms of closed networks versus open networks, small amounts of economic synergies versus massive amounts of open economic synergies, intranets versus internets, private blockchains versus public blockchains. So Veritasium takes the public blockchain, opens it up to everybody to transact directly without banks. On that note, and that was rather exasperating, pardon me, I hope I didn't lose anybody. So on that note, we now have a Bloomberg article where Bill Gross says that Bitcoin and blockchains will challenge central banks and banks in general. And of course it will, because central banks are trying, central banks are the bankers for other banks. And the central banks have saved their clients, which were other banks, by lifting them by the water, by the neck. So they prevent them from drowning by choking them out. Save the balance sheet, attack the income statement. So in doing that, you drive rates down. Once rates go negative, it's a perversion of economic nature. It's a perversion of reality. It causes a perverse incentive not to make money. You can actually borrow money and get paid for borrow money. So many problems with it. It's not even worth going through. The most significant problem, one I'd like to mention, is the fact that it has never worked. QE, NERP, has never been proven to work. Japan had a lost decade in the 80s. It is 2016. They are still lost. So you have the 34-year-old lost decade. At what point do we get the message? I think they will get the message when entities such as Veritasium take this newfound peer-to-peer style technology and uses it to connect peers versus using it to make a service-centric hub and spoke system cleaner or spiffier with a patina on it. Why polish up old technology when you could take an entire new business paradigm and empower the people? And when I say people, I just don't mean Paul, Paulette. I mean small businesses, medium businesses, even large businesses, GE Capital, AIG, etc. But in order to do this, you have to take money out of the banker's pocket. This is a byproduct of what Veritasium does. Not what we're setting out to do. We're setting out to make a more efficient, more accessible market for everybody. Just like the internet made information more efficient, more accessible, Veritasium is becoming a platform for the peer-to-peer economy to make value transfer and value access more efficient and more accessible. In doing that, you crush margins, and the current gatekeepers, unless they find a new way to add value, will fall to the wayside, such as the media companies have done in the 2000s, such as cassette tracks and 8-track players, point and shoot cameras from cell phones, etc. Progress goes on, technology goes on. Veritasium is where technology meets finance. They come together and you have progress. Peace, au revoir, cheers, sayonara, ciao, bye.